I'm back with Stephen Meyer, the director of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, author of Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen, we were talking about the argument from beginnings, from the fact that the universe has a beginning. Before I jump on to argument number two, I do want to mention and have you spell out that Einstein, whose own equations and theory of relativity predicted a beginning, was unhappy with the idea of a beginning and, in a sense, fudged his equations to try to make that not be so. Talk a little bit about why Einstein, a great scientist, might have been motivated to do that.
Well, at that time in his career, in the early teen or late teens and early 20s, he was still very much a dedicated scientific materialist. I think there was a shift in his worldview over time. But a great physicist from Princeton in the 60s, Robert Dicke, explained, the unease that many physicists felt about the Big Bang Theory when it was first proposed. He said, an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. If the universe has always been here, then we can say that the universe is the thing from which everything else comes, and materialism holds. But if the universe itself comes into existence, then, as I was mentioning in the last segment, it becomes very difficult to explain the origin of the universe materialistically, because, again, it's matter that comes into existence, and there's no matter before that could have caused that event. Einstein was acutely aware of this. He actually accused Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian Catholic priest, who was probably the ultimate author of the Big Bang Theory, of doing so on the basis of Christian theology. And Lemaitre bristled at that and said, no, actually, it's your worldview that's holding you up from seeing what the scientific evidence is showing. And what Einstein did was, his theory of general relativity implies that matter actually curves space, and that there's a or space-time. And so if the only force that exists in the universe was gravity, then we should live in a giant black hole. But since we don't live in a giant black hole, since there's empty space between all the bodies, the galaxies and so forth, there must be some outward pushing force that counteracts gravity, that's creating the expansion that creates the space. And that was the natural implication of his theory. But he fiddled with the equations to try to get the force of gravity and the force of the outward pushing force exactly balanced, so he could continue to portray the universe as static. As I like to say in the book, the heavens talked back, and the evidence showed that the universe is actually expanding. And later, Einstein recanted. He went out to California to Mount Wilson, visited the astronomer Edwin Hubble, and saw the evidence for himself, and later said that denying the evidence for the beginning of the universe was the greatest blunder of his life.
Let's talk about the second argument that you unfurl in the book, an argument that is sometimes called the fine-tuning argument. You use the phrase, which I guess other physicists do as well, that we live in a Goldilocks universe. And I take it by Goldilocks the idea that the universe is sort of cooked just right. It's not too hot, it's not too cold. Say what we mean when we talk about the phrase a Goldilocks universe.
Yeah, it's just a colloquial way of talking about the fine-tuning, that there are this ensemble of physical parameters that, for no underlying physical or logical reason, have very precise values or strengths that allow the universe to exist. And moreover, those parameters fall within very narrow ranges that make their existence extremely improbable, and cumulatively even more improbable. I mean, exponentially big numbers associated with the fine-tuning, or very small probabilities. And the question is, why do we have a universe where the outward pushing force I was talking about is called the cosmological constant? It's fine-tuned to 1 part, and then the 90th power is an accepted value. That's just one of those parameters. There are only 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the entire universe. So the odds of getting that one parameter right would be roughly the odds of sending a blindfolded man out into space looking for one marked elementary particle, but not just in our universe, but in 10 billion universes our size. It's the degree of fine-tuning is beyond exquisite. We don't really have adjectives to capture it. So as one physicist, great physicist, Sir Fred Hoyle, put it, a common sense interpretation of the physics suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry to make life possible. With the fine tuning suggests a fine tuner.
And I think these statements, including Hoyle's statement, are important because it's not as if Hoyle was happy to say that. It's almost as if these physicists are themselves leaning in the atheist direction, but are dragged kicking and screaming by the fine-tuning evidence to say, we don't see any other way that this could have come about. Now, there is a sort of a fallback position, as you know, and there are scientists today who recognize that the combination of elements producing our universe is so unlikely that the only way to sort of explain them is to hypothetically posit, without a shred of empirical evidence, that there are millions, if not an infinity, of other universes, and out of this kind of unbelievable infinity of universes, there just happens to be one, ours, that happens to have all these exquisite qualities that make possible life. Why do you think that this notion of an infinity of universes, never observed and never detected by any scientific instrument, why is that not something that is easy to believe in?
Well, it's fantastic and exotic in that sense, but it has, even if we posit it as a logically possible explanation, it has a very serious defect. It's called the multiverse. And the multiverse hypothesis requires, as a condition of its success, not just the existence of all those other universes, and millions wouldn't do it. It would have to be quasi infinite to account for the degree of fine tuning, the improbability of those parameters we're talking about. But a condition of the success of that explanation is not just that there are the other universes, but there's some type of underlying universe generating mechanism that allows us to portray our universe as a kind of lucky winner in a great cosmic lottery. If we just have other universes that are causally disconnected from our own, then what happens in those other universes has no effect on our universe, including whatever set the fine-tuning parameters. So therefore, in virtue of that, the multiverse proponents have proposed these underlying universe-generating mechanisms, and that's where the rub comes in. Even in theory, these universe-generating mechanisms, some based on string theory, some based on what's called inflationary cosmology, but even in theory, these universe-generating mechanisms themselves require prior unexplained fine-tuning. So the fine-tuning is never actually explained. It's just pushed out of view and located in the fine-tuning mechanism, the universe-generating mechanism, ultimately, but without explanation. So I think they fail to explain what they're trying to explain, which is the source of fine-tuning.
Not to mention the fact that the fine-tuning argument, what I love about this, Stephen, is that there's a breathtaking simplicity here. We're using the logic of Occam's razor. Hey, gee, if we see all this fine-tuning, the most obvious explanation is a fine-tuner, right? And it doesn't take a whole bunch of faith to go from the fine-tuning to the fine-tuner. It seems to me to take a lot more faith to go from the fine-tuning to go, wait a minute, the reason that we have this particular symphony is there's an infinity of symphonies out there with all kinds of random noises, and one of them just happens to be, Mozart, and that's our universe. That seems to be far more ridiculous, to require far more faith than simply to go, we've got Mozart's symphony, and you know what? There's probably some Mozart who came up with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just all the other universes. It's also the theoretical entities that are presupposed in these speculative cosmological models of inflationary cosmology and string theory. You actually have to conjoin them to explain all the fine-tuning, and then you have to believe in extra unobserved dimensions of space. With string theory, you have to believe in something called an inflaton field with the inflationary cosmology. And I actually count them up. There's about 10 different theoretical entities, pure theoretical postulates for which we can have no direct empirical evidence. Now, we obviously can't have direct empirical evidence of God either. But the question is, since we have to posit something observable to explain the origin and fine-tuning of our universe, what's a simpler explanation? One God or many universes and all those underlying theoretical entities that come with the universe-generating mechanisms.
Let's take a pause. When we come back, I'm going to ask Stephen Meyer about the third line of evidence that points to the accuracy of the God hypothesis.